A millionaire is stunned by the beauty of a gay homeless man sleeping in front of his company. The morning rush was always the same. People in suits moving like clockwork, cars honking in the distance, the city alive with routine. But today, something stopped me. Right there, in front of my company's grand entrance, a man lay curled up beneath a worn-out blanket. I had walked past countless homeless people before, never giving them more than a passing glance. But this time was different. This time I noticed him. His dark hair was a mess, his face shadowed with exhaustion. But even beneath the layers of struggle, his beauty was undeniable. Sharp cheekbones, strong jawline, full lips that seemed out of place in a life like his. And when he opened his eyes, deep, intense, hauntingly beautiful, something in me shifted. I should have walked away. I should have ignored him like I always did. But for some reason, I couldn't. And that moment, that hesitation, changed everything. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This is a story that will stay with you long after it's over. The city never truly slept, but in the early hours of the morning, there was a brief moment where everything stood still. The streets were nearly empty, the air was crisp, and the towering glass skyscrapers reflected the first light of day. I stepped out of my car, the familiar sight of Pierce Global Enterprises looming above me. Another day, another empire to run. My mind was already occupied with the usual, board meetings, investment strategies, and the never-ending pressure of being at the top. But then I saw him. Curled up against the side of my building, wrapped in nothing but a tattered blanket, was a man. I should have walked past him. He was just another homeless figure blending into the cityscape, a sight I had become desensitized to over the years. But something made me stop. It wasn't pity. It wasn't guilt. It was him. Even in his desperate state, his beauty was undeniable. His dark hair fell in messy waves, framing a face that could have belonged to a model. High cheekbones, strong jawline, full lips that seemed too perfect for a man who had lost everything. And then he stirred. Slowly, his eyes flickered open, adjusting to the light. That was the moment everything changed, because his eyes weren't empty like the others I had seen in his situation. They weren't lifeless, dulled by hardship. They were fierce, intense, alive. A deep, ocean-dark gaze locked onto mine, and for a second, it felt like I couldn't move. A strange sensation curled in my chest, a pull I didn't understand. Then, as if reality snapped back into place, a voice interrupted the moment. "Sir?" Malik, my head of security, stepped beside me. "Do you want me to remove him?" Remove him. As if he were nothing. I should have said yes. It was the logical thing to do. Instead, I hesitated. And in that hesitation, the man on the ground smirked. A slow, knowing smirk. He had caught my hesitation, and something in his expression told me he wasn't surprised. The tension stretched between us, silent but deafening. I should have walked away. But I didn't. And that decision, it changed everything. I should have ignored him. I should have nodded at Malik, let him do his job, and walked into my office like I did every other day. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, staring at this beautiful, wrecked stranger curled up against my building like he belonged there. Like he had every right to be right in my path, making me hesitate, making me question. His smirk hadn't faded. Even in his current state, exhausted, unshaven, wrapped in a dirty blanket on the cold pavement, he looked at me like he had already won something, and that bothered me. "Sir?" Malik prompted again, waiting for my decision. I inhaled sharply, turning to my security chief. "No, let him be." Malik's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he nodded without question. Years of working for me had taught him that I never explained myself. I turned back to the homeless man, expecting his smirk to falter, for him to show some gratitude, some acknowledgement of what I had just done. Instead, he chuckled, low, quiet, but enough. "What's so funny?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. He shrugged, shifting slightly against the cold stone wall. Even the way he moved was deliberate, controlled. Didn't expect the great Nathan Pierce to have a soft spot. I stiffened. "You know who I am?" Another smirk. "Everyone in this city knows who you are. Rich, powerful, untouchable, the kind of man who never stops to look down at the people beneath him." I narrowed my eyes. "And yet here you are, right at my feet." His lips twitched, but this time the amusement in his expression dimmed just slightly. Something told me he wasn't always like this. This wasn't a man who was born into struggle. This was someone who had fallen. Hard. And yet, he didn't beg. He didn't look away. There was no shame in his eyes. That, more than anything, intrigued me. "You have a name?" I asked before I could stop myself. He let out a slow breath, as if considering whether or not to humor me. Finally, he answered, "Caleb." Just a name. No last name. No explanation. I studied him for a long moment before shifting my gaze to the entrance of my building. I needed to walk away. I needed to forget this man existed. But for some reason, the thought of leaving him there made my stomach tighten. It made no sense. "You have somewhere to go, Caleb?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. A flicker of something crossed his expression. Surprise, wariness. He didn't answer. "Do you?" I pressed. He exhaled slowly. "What do you think?" I clenched my jaw. Then, before I could think it through, before I could talk myself out of it, I made a decision. "Come with me." For the first time, Caleb's confident, easy demeanor faltered. "What?" "You need a shower, clean clothes, a real meal." I kept my tone neutral, unreadable. "I can arrange that." Caleb's lips parted slightly, his dark eyes searching mine. I expected him to jump at the offer. Most people would. Instead, he did something unexpected. He laughed, a low, rough sound that held no real amusement. "You want to play savior, Mr. Pierce?" His voice was smooth, taunting. "Feeling guilty about all your billions?" I exhaled through my nose, my patience thinning. "I don't feel guilty about anything. I'm offering you a place to stay for one night, nothing more." Caleb's gaze hardened slightly, and for the first time I saw it. Pride. He didn't want to owe anyone, not even me. "You can sleep on the streets if you prefer," I added coolly. "Or you can take the offer and at least get through one night without freezing to death." A long pause. Caleb's jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides, and then, slowly, he nodded. "Fine," he said, voice quieter now. I turned to Malik. "Bring the car around." As we walked toward the sleek black vehicle waiting at the curb, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a decision I would never be able to undo. Because I hadn't just invited a stranger into my world. I had invited something dangerous, something uncontrollable. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure if I was the one in control anymore. The car ride was silent, but thick with tension. Caleb sat beside me in the back seat, his fingers absently picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. He hadn't said much since agreeing to come with me, but I could feel it. The weight of his hesitation, the way he kept his posture deliberately relaxed, even though his entire body was wired with tension. I didn't blame him. A homeless man being invited into the car of a billionaire? He had every reason to be suspicious. The driver maneuvered through the city with precision, weaving past honking taxis and late-night stragglers. Outside, New York pulsed with life, but inside the car, it felt like another world entirely. Caleb finally broke the silence. "You do this often?" His voice was smooth but edged with something sharp. I glanced at him. "Do what?" He smirked, though there was no real amusement behind it. "Pick up lost causes off the street." I held his gaze for a second before answering. "No." His smirk faltered slightly, but he masked it well. "Then why me?" It was the question I had been avoiding since the moment I laid eyes on him. Why him? I could have kept walking. I could have ordered security to remove him. But something about Caleb had gotten under my skin, and I couldn't figure out why. So I gave him the only answer I was willing to admit. "You were in my way." He let out a quiet laugh. "Right. So I should be grateful?" "You should be smart enough to take the opportunity," I said, my voice even. His smirk vanished. His jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. A moment later, the car slowed to a stop in front of my building, a towering luxury residence in the heart of Manhattan, the kind of place people like him didn't step foot in. The valet opened the door, and I stepped out first, expecting Caleb to follow. But he didn't move. He stared up at the building, something flickering behind his eyes, not awe, not excitement, something else, something I couldn't place. "Problem?" I asked. Caleb blinked, then shook his head, the guarded look returning. "No problem, Mr. Pierce." His voice was casual, but something about the way he said my name made something tighten in my chest. We entered through the private lobby, bypassing the curious stares of the staff. They knew better than to question me, but I could feel the judgment in the air. Caleb felt it too. "You like making people uncomfortable, don't you?" he murmured as we stepped into the elevator. I glanced at him. "I don't care what people think." His lips twitched. "Of course you don't." The doors slid shut, sealing us in. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, Caleb exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. "What exactly do you expect from me?" The way he said it, calm but with an edge of something else, made my stomach tighten. I turned to face him fully. "What do you think I expect?" Caleb's jaw clenched. His eyes met mine, challenging me. He thought I was like the others, that I wanted something in return. I stepped closer, not breaking his gaze. "I don't expect anything from you, Caleb. I'm giving you a place to sleep, a shower, some food. That's all." He held my stare, searching for something. Doubt, deception, anything that would confirm what he already believed about men like me. But when he found nothing, he finally nodded. "Fine." The elevator dinged. The doors slid open to my penthouse, and Caleb stepped into my world. The moment we walked in, Caleb froze. His eyes swept across the massive open space, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the sleek furniture, the kind of wealth that was so effortless, so normal to me, but completely foreign to him. For the first time, he looked uneasy. I watched as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his fingers tightening around the strap of his backpack, a small, tattered thing that looked like it had been through hell. "You can put that down," I said, gesturing to the bag. He hesitated, then shook his head. "I'll keep it with me." I let it go. "Bathroom is down the hall. Get cleaned up. I'll have food ready when you're done." Caleb didn't move right away. He looked at me again, that same strange intensity in his gaze. Then, finally, he nodded and walked toward the bathroom. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair as I moved toward the kitchen. What the hell was I doing? I didn't know this man. I didn't owe him anything. And yet, I had just brought a complete stranger into my home. And for some reason, it didn't feel like a mistake. 15 minutes later, I walked past the guest bathroom and stopped in my tracks. The door wasn't fully shut. Through the small gap, I could see Caleb standing in front of the mirror. His back was to me, his shirt tossed to the floor. And that's when I saw them. Scars. Long, faded lines across his shoulder blades, his spine, his ribs. Evidence of a past he hadn't spoken about. Something sharp twisted in my chest, and before I could stop myself, I knocked. Caleb tensed. Then, slowly, he turned his head, catching me watching. For the first time since we met, his confidence cracked. He looked vulnerable, and I had a feeling that if I pushed, I would finally learn who Caleb really was. The silence between us stretched, thick and suffocating. Caleb stood motionless in front of the mirror, his back half turned to me, the scars on his skin exposed under the dim bathroom light. I hadn't meant to look, I hadn't meant to see, but now that I had, I couldn't ignore it. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders tensing as if bracing for something. "Are you just going to stand there?" His voice was quieter than before, lacking the sharp edge he usually carried. I could have turned away. I could have pretended I hadn't noticed. Instead, I stepped inside. Caleb watched me through the reflection in the mirror, his dark eyes unreadable. I stopped a few feet away, my gaze flickering to the scars that crisscrossed his back. They weren't fresh, but they weren't ancient either. Some had faded into pale lines. Others still held the faint pink of wounds that had taken longer to heal. I clenched my jaw. "Who did that to you?" He let out a small, humorless laugh. "You don't get to ask that." "I just did." His fingers twitched against the counter, but he didn't answer. He didn't have to. The way his body stiffened, the way his lips pressed into a thin line, that told me everything. Someone had hurt him. Badly, and he wasn't ready to talk about it. Fine. I could wait. I took a step back, my voice steady. "There are clean towels in the cabinet. Take your time." Caleb didn't look at me as I left the bathroom, but I felt the weight of his gaze on my back until the door shut between us. I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair as I headed toward the kitchen. I didn't know what the hell I was doing anymore. I had brought this man, a complete stranger, into my home, and now I was standing in my own penthouse, feeling more unsettled than I had in years. Caleb wasn't just some guy sleeping on the streets. He had a past, a story, and whether I liked it or not, I was already too damn curious to walk away from it. 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps approaching the kitchen. I turned and stilled. Caleb stood in the doorway, freshly showered, wearing the clothes I had left for him. Simple sweatpants and a black t-shirt that fit a little too snugly over his lean frame. His damp hair curled slightly at the ends, and for the first time, he didn't look like someone who had spent the night on the streets. But the thing that caught my attention the most? His guard was still up, even now, clean, warm, safe. He didn't look comfortable. I gestured toward the counter. "Sit." Caleb hesitated for only a second before walking over and lowering himself onto one of the bar stools. I slid a plate in front of him. Grilled chicken, rice, vegetables. Nothing fancy, but real food. He stared at it. I arched a brow. "Are you going to eat or just admire it?" Caleb exhaled sharply and picked up the fork. "Just making sure it's not poisoned." I rolled my eyes. "Right. Because that makes sense." He smirked, just slightly, before taking his first bite. The second the food hit his tongue, his body visibly relaxed. He tried to hide it, but I saw the way his shoulders lost their tension, the way his grip on the fork eased. He was hungry. I said nothing, letting him eat in peace. For a few minutes, the only sound was the quiet clinking of his fork against the plate. Then, softly, Caleb spoke. "Thank you." I glanced at him, surprised. His head was still lowered, eyes focused on his food, but there was something different about his tone. It wasn't sarcastic, it wasn't defensive. It was real, and for some reason, that single moment of honesty hit me harder than anything else had. I leaned back against the counter, crossing my arms. "What's your story, Caleb?" He froze mid-bite. Then, slowly, he set the fork down and wiped his mouth with a napkin. He looked at me, and for the first time since we met, his confidence wasn't so effortless. "You really want to know?" I nodded once. Caleb leaned forward, his elbows resting on the counter, his dark eyes locked onto mine. "Then let's make a deal." I frowned. "A deal?" "You tell me something about you, and I'll tell you something about me." I narrowed my eyes. "That's ridiculous." He smirked. "No, it's fair." I exhaled, shaking my head. "Fine. What do you want to know?" Caleb tilted his head, studying me. "What's the worst thing you've ever done?" The question caught me off guard. For a second, I considered lying, but something about the way he was looking at me, curious, patient, unbothered by wealth or power, made me realize that if I wanted him to open up, I had to give him something real in return. I swallowed. "Fired someone who didn't deserve it," I admitted. "Ruined their career." Caleb arched a brow. "That's it?" "It's what I'm willing to tell you." He huffed a soft laugh. "Fair enough." Then he leaned back, stretching his arms above his head, exposing a small sliver of skin where his shirt lifted. "Now my turn," he said casually. And then, just as easily as if he were commenting on the weather, "I used to have a life, a real one, until someone I trusted decided to destroy it." I stilled. Caleb smirked, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "You wanted a story, Mr. Pierce," he murmured. "Be careful what you wish for." I didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything started to spiral. This was the moment Caleb stopped being a stranger and became something I couldn't walk away from. That night I couldn't sleep. Caleb's words played in my head over and over, until someone I trusted decided to destroy it. I didn't ask for details. I didn't push. But I knew that whatever had happened to him, it had broken something inside him. And now, for reasons I couldn't explain, I wanted to know who had done it. The next morning, I found him on the balcony, staring at the city skyline. He didn't turn when I stepped beside him. "You're still here," I said. Caleb exhaled. "For now." Something in his tone made my chest tighten. I should have let him go. Should have let him walk away before this got too complicated. Instead, I asked, "If you had the chance to fix everything, would you?" Caleb finally looked at me, and for the first time, there was no sarcasm, no smirk. "Would it change anything?" he murmured. I didn't have an answer. And maybe neither did he. Later that night, everything fell apart. Caleb was in the living room when my phone buzzed. A name I hadn't seen in years. Jared Cole, a former business partner, a man I had burned bridges with long ago. And the second I saw his name, Caleb's voice echoed in my head. Someone I trusted decided to destroy my life. The realization hit like a gunshot. Jared wasn't calling me by accident. He knew Caleb was here. He was coming for him, and for the first time in years, I was afraid. Not for me, for him. When the knock came, Caleb stiffened. I already knew who it was. Jared stood in the doorway, a cruel smile on his lips. "Long time, Nathan," he said smoothly. Then his gaze flickered over my shoulder. To Caleb. I heard Caleb's sharp inhale. His body went rigid. Jared smirked. "Surprised to see me?" Caleb didn't move, didn't speak, but the look in his eyes told me everything. This wasn't just someone who had hurt him. This was the man who had ruined his life. And now, he had found him again.